The letter arrived at the Vatican at dawn. It was short, defiant, and it carried the weight of a rupture that had been building for decades. Pope Leo XIV read it once, then again. Then he set it down on his desk, looked out at the empty courtyard below, and said 4 words that would soon echo across the entire Catholic world. Then it is done. What happened over the next 72 hours would split the Catholic Church in a way not seen since 1988. And the fallout is still unfolding right now. It started with a warning. The kind no one wanted to give. The kind that means every option has already failed. On June 29, 2026, Pope Leo XIV sat inside his private study in the Apostolic Palace. The sun was going down over Rome. Orange light spilled through the tall windows and fell across his desk. He had moved into the renovated papal apartments with a small group of Augustinian brothers shortly after his election. The room was austere by Vatican standards. A crucifix on the wall, a wooden desk, stacks of paper, no gold, no velvet, just the tools of a man who believed the church needed honesty more than decoration. He had been on the phone for most of the afternoon. Senior cardinals, the head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, his personal secretary. Everyone was telling him the same thing. It was too late. The wheels were already turning. The seminary in Switzerland was preparing. The invitations had been sent. The vestments had been pressed. The bishops had already arrived. But Leo was not a man who gave up easily. He picked up his pen. That evening, Leo signed a letter addressed to one man, Father David Paglarani, the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, a group that had been a thorn in the Vatican side for half a century. The letter was not long. It was not diplomatic. It was a final plea. The last card Leo had to play before everything fell apart. Leo had spent his first 14 months as Pope, preaching unity. He had opened doors, extended hands, and allowed a prominent American cardinal to celebrate the old Latin Mass inside St. Peter's Basilica itself, something Pope Francis would never have permitted. Leo was trying. He was trying harder than any pope in decades to bring the traditionalist wing back into the fold. But the SSPX had other plans. For months, the society had been preparing something that would shake Rome to its core. They were going to consecrate 4 new bishops without the Pope's permission, without his blessing, without any canonical authority whatsoever. And in the Catholic Church, that is not just a disagreement. That is an act of war. Leo's letter was blunt. He told Paglarani that consecrating bishops without papal mandate was a sin of extreme gravity, that it would bring automatic excommunication, that it would harm the very faithful the SPX claimed to protect. He urged them to stop, to turn back, to think about what they were about to do. The SSPX read the letter and they ignored it. What most people outside the Catholic world don't understand is how explosive this moment really was. The SSPX is not some tiny fringe group meeting in the basement. They have 6 bishops, over 750 priests, 264 seminarians spread across 5 seminaries worldwide. They have 250 religious sisters. They operate chapels and schools across the globe. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 Catholics attend their masses regularly. And now every single one of those people was caught in the crossfire. On the morning of July 1st, the Alpine village of Aon, Switzerland woke up to something it had never seen before. Over 15,000 people had traveled from every corner of the world to a meadow outside the SSPX seminary. They came from France, from Germany, from the United States, from Argentina. They wore free white hats stamped with Akon 2026. From above, the crowd looked like a snowfield pressed against the green Swiss hills. A massive tent had been erected. Inside, altars were prepared. Mitres and pastoral staff had been laid out with military precision. The air smelled of incense. Gregorian chants echoed through speakers set up across the field. Over 1,000 clergy had gathered in formation, and then the ceremony began. It lasted 5 hours. Every word spoken in Latin, every gesture drawn from a rite that predated the Second Vatican Council by centuries. The 4 men being consecrated knelt at the altar. Pascal Schribert of Switzerland, Michael Goldade of the United States, Michel Pouans de Séville of France, Marc Hanapierre, also of France. 2 existing SSPX bishops presided over the ceremony. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the consequences. They knew that the moment they laid hands on those 4 men, they would be severing the last thread, connecting them to Rome. And they did it anyway. The atmosphere inside the tent was electric. Nuns in full habits knelt in rows. Young families held sleeping children. Seminarians stood at attention. Elderly men who had attended the original 1988 consecrations wiped tears from their eyes. For them, this was not rebellion. This was preservation. This was survival. Before the consecration began, a statement was read aloud to the crowd. It declared that any punishment or sanction the Vatican might impose would have no validity, that the society answered to a higher authority, that what Rome called disobedience they called fidelity. The crowd erupted. Applause, tears. Some raised their rosaries toward the sky. Others clasped their hands together and whispered prayers that were older than the reforms they rejected. Father Paglarani himself delivered the sermon. He spoke in French, his voice heavy with emotion. He told the crowd that the SSPX was not rejecting the Pope. He said they loved the Pope. But he added something that stunned everyone listening. He said they did not want to see the Pope humiliated anymore, standing next to what he called false priests, representing false religions. That sentence traveled around the world in minutes, but something else happened during that ceremony that no one had planned. Just before Holy Communion, the sky above Icone turned black. The thunder rolled across the valley. Rain came down in sheets, the kind of rain that feels personal. The ceremony had to pause for nearly an hour. People scrambled under tents. Those without cover stood in the downpour, drenched, clutching rosary beads that dripped with water. And then something remarkable happened. They started singing a Maria Christus Vincit over and over in the rain and the mud. With their white hats plastered to their heads, they sang until the storm passed. When the sun broke through again, the ceremony resumed. The consecration was completed. 4 new bishops stood before the crowd. The SSPX now had 6 bishops total, and not one of them had the Pope's approval. Inside the Vatican, the reaction was immediate, and it was furious. Leo had watched the situation unfold in real time. Aides had been providing updates throughout the morning. Phone calls from Swiss bishops, messages from the Apostolic Nuncio, reports from journalists on the ground streaming the event live. When the final blessing was given, and the 4 new bishops stood before the crowd wearing their mitres, holding their pastoral staffs, the mood inside the Apostolic Palace shifted like a door slamming shut. Leo summoned his closest advisors. The conversation was short. There would be no more olive branches, no more letters, no more pleas. The SSPX had made its choice. Now the Vatican would make its own, and it would make it loudly enough that the entire Catholic world would hear it. On the morning of July the 2nd, the Vatican's disaster for the doctrine of the faith issued its decree, and it was far more severe than anyone had expected. The decree did not simply excommunicate the 4 new bishops and the 2 who consecrated them. That was the minimum required by canon law. The Vatican went further, much further. First, the decree declared the Society of St. Pius X to be in formal schism. Not just the bishops, the entire organization, every priest, every brother, every sister. And then it turned its attention to the faithful. The decree stated that any Catholic who formally adhered to the SPX was now considered schismatic and excommunicated. That meant not just the priests and bishops. That meant the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Catholics sitting in SPX pews every Sunday. But the Vatican was not done. The decree went on to revoke concessions that had stood for years. Under Pope Francis, SSPX priests had been granted the ability to hear valid confessions. Francis had also allowed them to officiate marriages that the Church would recognize. Both of those concessions were now gone, wiped out in a single document. Confessions heard by SPX priests were now invalid. Every sin confessed to an SSPX priest since the decree. Absolved in the eyes of the penitent, but now meaningless in the eyes of Rome. Marriages witnessed by Saxe priests were now invalid. Couples who had stood before those altars and sworn their vows now found themselves in canonical terms unmarried. Sacraments administered by their clergy were declared unlawful, not invalid in every case. The Masses themselves were still technically valid because a validly ordained priest always celebrates a valid Mass, but illicit, forbidden, unauthorized. A distinction that sounds academic until you realize what it means in practice. It means that going to an SPX Mass on Sunday does not fulfill your obligation as a Catholic. It means that the communion you receive there, while technically the body of Christ is given to you by a priest, the Church considers outside its walls. It means that everything you thought was keeping you connected to the faith is now officially pulling you away from it. For hundreds of thousands of Catholics around the world, the ground had just disappeared beneath their feet, and for many of them, it was the Vatican that had pulled it out. The SSPX's media manager, Marc-André Mabillard, expressed shock at the severity. He called the sanctions unjust. He said the society was changing absolutely nothing in its plans. And that line, perhaps more than anything else, captured the depth of the divide because the Vatican was not asking. The Vatican was telling, and the SSPX was refusing to listen. Within hours, bishops across the world began issuing their own statements. In San Antonio, Texas, the local archbishop told his parishioners to stop attending the SSPX chapel in the city immediately. He directed them instead to St. Timothy Catholic Church, which offered the traditional Latin Mass under diocese and authority. He offered personal pastoral assistance to anyone who wanted to return to full communion with Rome. In San Angelo, Texas, the local bishop echoed the same message. He urged Catholics drawn to the Latin Mass to attend the approved parish of St. Margaret of Scotland. He reminded them that the Church, as he put it, would welcome with sincere affection all those who wished to return. In Minnesota, at the historic Church of St. Agnes and St. Paul, the pastor addressed his congregation directly. He told them there was a difference between being rooted and being stuck. St. Agnes was not affiliated with the SSPX. They offered the Latin Mass with full papal permission, and they would continue to do so in full communion with Pope Leo XIV. But across the SPX's global network, the mood was very different. In chapels from Paris to Buenos Aires to Kansas City, Catholics who had built their entire spiritual lives around the SSPX were now being told that their confessions were meaningless, their marriages were invalid, their priests were excommunicated, and if they stayed, they were too. Families were torn. Some had attended SPX masses for decades. Some had been baptized there, married there, buried their parents from those altars. And now Rome was telling them to walk away or face the harshest penalty the Catholic Church can impose. The timing made everything worse. Because while this crisis was exploding inside the Church, Pope Leo XIV had something else on his calendar. Something that would put him on a global stage at the worst possible moment. On the evening of July 3rd, the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia held its 38th annual Liberty Medal ceremony, and the recipient was Pope Leo XIV. The medal honors individuals who promote liberty around the world. Previous recipients include Vladimir Zelensky, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and John Lewis. Now it was going to the first American pope. Leo addressed the crowd via live video from the Vatican. He appeared calm, composed, wearing the medal he had been presented weeks earlier during a private ceremony at the Vatican. Behind him, the simple furnishings of his study, no throne, no pageantry. He spoke for 10 minutes. His voice was steady, measured, the voice of a man who had spent decades giving homilies in mountain parishes in Peru, and was now addressing the most powerful nation on earth. He called himself a son of a great country. He invoked the founding fathers. He spoke about liberty, conscience, and the dignity of human life. He said that a country's vitality is deeply tied to the value it places on human life in every form and condition. He mentioned America's history of welcoming successive waves of immigrants and called it a byword for freedom. He asked God to bless America's future. He never mentioned Donald Trump by name. He never mentioned immigration crackdowns. He never mentioned the SSPX by name, but everyone watching knew what was underneath those words. Unity. That was the word Leo kept returning to. Unity, justice, peace. The same themes he had been preaching since his first day as Pope. The same themes that were now being tested in ways he could never have imagined. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro called him a religious leader who had made an extraordinary impact on the world. More than 30 different religious traditions were represented in the audience. The ceremony was broadcast on screens across Independence Mall, steps from where the Declaration of Independence was signed exactly 250 years before. And the next day, on July 4th, Leo did something unprecedented. He visited the residence of the United States ambassador to the Holy See in Rome. Ambassador Brian Birch, a Catholic himself, hosted the Pope for dinner to celebrate America's 250th birthday. Photos from the evening showed Leo smiling, relaxed, sitting with the ambassador's family in a moment of warmth that felt almost ordinary. But earlier that same day, Leo had been at Lampedusa, the Italian island that had become a symbol of the migrant crisis. He had visited a cemetery there where unnamed migrants who drowned in the Mediterranean were buried. He had prayed. He had knelt. He had said nothing to the cameras. The contrast was devastating, deliberate, perhaps in the morning, kneeling among the unmarked graves of people who had died trying to reach the freedom that others take for granted. Men, women, and children whose names no one remembers, whose stories ended in the dark water between Africa and Europe. In the evening, celebrating that same freedom's 250th birthday with an American ambassador under the warm lights of a Roman villa, surrounded by flags and laughter and the smell of good food. That was Leo, always holding two truths at once, always reminding the world that joy and grief are not opposites, they are neighbors. And all while back in Switzerland, the SSPX was digging in deeper, issuing statements, rallying supporters, preparing to weather the storm the same way they had weathered every storm for the last 50 years, by refusing to budge. By July 5th, the ripples were reaching every corner of the Catholic world. In France, where the traditional Latin Mass has a particularly strong following, loyal traditionalist groups rushed to distance themselves from the SSPX. Philippe Darentière, president of NRAM des Chrétientés, the organization that runs the massive annual Pentecost pilgrimage to Chartres, drawing 20,000 walkers, made his position clear. His organization was loyal to Rome. They were already working with the archdiocese of Paris to prepare for something extraordinary. Pope Leo was planning a visit to France in September, a prayer vigil with young people at the Place de Concorde, a papal mass along the Shah, an expected crowd of nearly 500,000. Darentière's organization had been asked to provide volunteers. Their logistics coordinator had been named deputy coordinator for the papal events. They were not about to throw that away for the sake of the SSPX's defiance, but the SSPX itself showed no signs of backing down. Mabilad continued to speak to the press. He called the sanctions unjust. He said the society believed its mission was greater than any pain Rome could inflict. Paglani urged Leo to reconsider the penalties. And at the heart of it all, one question hung over everything. The same question that Leo had been wrestling with since the moment he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's on the night of May 8th, 2025. How do you hold a church together when part of it does not want to be held? Leo had inherited a church already fractured by the tensions of the Francis era. Pope Francis had been beloved by many for his openness, his humility, his embrace of modernity. But he had also alienated conservative and traditionalist Catholics who felt pushed to the margins. His restrictions on the Latin Mass in 2021 had been a breaking point for many. When Leo was elected on that extraordinary evening in May 2025, the white smoke rising above the Sistine Chapel, the bells of St. Peter's ringing across Rome, the stunned crowd learning that the new pope was an American, something unprecedented in 2,000 years of church history, he tried to walk a different path. He was not Francis. He was not Benedict. He was something entirely new. An American Austinian born in Chicago, raised in the suburb of Dalton by a school principal father and a librarian mother, a man who had entered the seminary as a teenager and never looked back. He had studied mathematics at Villanova University, canon law in Rome. He had spent decades doing missionary work in Peru, living among the poorest communities in South America. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He had been a groundskeeper at a cemetery before he was a priest. He had governed the entire Augustinian order for 12 years. He was someone who believed in structure and order and the careful balancing of tradition and progress. And in his episcopal motto, in illo uno unum, meaning in the one Christ we are one, he had declared his entire vision for the church in 5 Latin words. He had shown that balance from his very first days, allowing the Latin Mass at St. Peter's, a gesture that sent shockwaves through both sides of the Catholic spectrum, reaching out to conservative cardinals who had felt sidelined under Francis, announcing that he wanted to meet with the full College of Cardinals annually as a group of advisors, speaking the language of unity at every single opportunity, in every homily, in every address, in every private meeting. His first apostolic exhortation, Dulex, meaning I have loved you, had focused on love for the poor and the injustice of global markets. It was passionate, direct, the kind of document that made wealthy donors in New York uncomfortable and brought tears to parish priests in Lemur. His encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, signed on the anniversary of Leo XIII's landmark Ram Noam, had warned against the dehumanizing potential of artificial intelligence and called for the protection of workers' rights. He had written that humanity faced a pressing duty to remain profoundly human in the era of machines. That document had been translated into 30 languages within a week. He had traveled to Turkey and Lebanon to mark the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nika. He had closed the Jubilee Year's holy door while criticizing how a distorted economy tries to profit from everything, including the human desire for joy. He had canonized Carlo Acutis and Pier Giorgio Frassi, holding them up as examples for young people to follow. And through all of it, he had kept one eye on the traditionalist wing, trying to show them that there was room, that they did not have to choose between their love of tradition and their love of the church. The SSPX had just told him that was not enough. What made this moment different from 1988 was the scale and the speed and the reach. When Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre consecrated bishops without papal approval back then, the SSPX was a smaller, more isolated movement. The internet did not exist. Social media did not exist. News traveled through newspapers and evening broadcasts. The global infrastructure of outrage and solidarity that can now be mobilized in hours simply was not there. Lefebvre's act was a scandal, yes, but it was a scandal contained by geography and time. In 2026, the SSPX had a professional media operation. Cameras had streamed the entire 5-hour ceremony live. Within minutes, clips were everywhere. Catholic Twitter exploded. YouTube channels ran emergency broadcasts. Commentators on both sides drew their lines. Traditionalist websites declared the Vatican's response an act of tyranny. Progressive Catholic outlets called the consecrations a betrayal of everything the modern church stood for. The SSPX had sympathetic voices in Catholic media worldwide. It had supporters who saw them not as schismatics, but as guardians. It had a narrative that resonated with a growing number of Catholics who felt the modern church had traded depth for relevance, mystery for accessibility, truth for politics. And it had 15,000 people in a Swiss meadow willing to stand in a thunderstorm to prove it. 15,000 people who had traveled from across the world, paid for flights, taken time off work, brought their children to watch 4 men kneel at an altar, and receive a blessing that Rome had explicitly forbidden. That is not a casual disagreement. That is conviction. And conviction, whether misguided or righteous, is the hardest thing in the world to argue against. For Leo, the crisis was not just about canon law. It was about identity. The SSPX claimed to be more Catholic than the Vatican. They accused the Church of modernism, liberalism, and error. They said only they were upholding the true faith of Christ, that framing turned every sanction into proof of persecution, every excommunication into a badge of honor. The Vatican understood this, and it was one reason the response was so harsh. By going beyond the minimum penalties, by targeting not just the bishops, but the priests and the faithful, the Vatican was drawing a line so clear that no one could pretend it was not there. You're either with the Church or you're outside it. There is no middle ground. But for the hundreds of thousands of ordinary Catholics caught in between, the line felt less like clarity and more like an ultimatum. In the days following the decree, stories began to emerge. Quiet, painful stories that had nothing to do with canon law and everything to do with human lives. A family in rural Normandy that had attended the same SSPX chapel for 3 generations. The grandmother had been baptized there. The mother had been married there. The children served as altar boys every Sunday. They had never considered themselves rebels. They had never thought of themselves as schismatic. They simply loved the Mass they had always known. And now Rome was telling them that the sacraments they had received for years, the confessions that had lifted burdens from their souls, the marriage that had bound them before God were invalid, as if they had never happened. A retired schoolteacher in Wisconsin, who had driven 40 minutes every Sunday to the nearest SPX Mass because it was the only Latin Mass available within 100 miles. She had tried other parishes. She had attended the Novus Ordo, but something in the silence and the reverence and the ancient words had called her back week after week, year after year. Now she was told she had to choose between the Mass she loved and the church she belonged to. A young couple in Buenos Aires who had been married by an SPX priest just 18 months earlier. Their families had gathered. Vows had been exchanged. Their first child had been baptized in that same chapel. And now in one document from Rome, none of it counted. Their marriage was not recognized. Their baptism was still valid. Baptisms always are. But the community that had celebrated it was now officially outside the church. A 25-year-old from Florida named Alexander de Velita, who had been baptized by an SPX priest and had recently moved to Spain. He told reporters in Ion that the consecration ceremony was a once-in-a-lifetime event. He felt no guilt, no shame, only gratitude that someone was willing to fight for the faith he believed in. These were not ideologues. These were not rebels. These were people who loved their faith and had found a home in a community that spoke to something deep within them. And now they had to choose. Stay and be cut off from Rome. Leave and lose everything that had given their spiritual lives shape and meaning. The Vatican's decree did include one important distinction. It noted that Catholics who had attended SSPX Masses purely for liturgical or spiritual reasons, without rejecting the Pope's authority, would not automatically face excommunication. The penalty applied only to those who formally adhered to the Society's positions. But in practice, that distinction was almost impossible to enforce. What does formal adherence look like? Is it signing a membership card? Is it donating money? Is it simply showing up every Sunday for years? The ambiguity was itself a source of anguish. Cardinal Gartmuller, the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, was asked what Catholics drawn to SPX Masses should do. His answer was unequivocal. They should not go. They cannot participate in the masses of schismatic priests and bishops. Period. Others were more nuanced. Theologians and canon lawyers debated the fine points on social media, in articles in parish halls. What about people who had attended casually? What about those who had gone to SSPX Masses because their local parish did not offer the Latin rite? What about children who had been brought there by their parents? No one had clean answers, and that was perhaps the most painful part of all. A church that prides itself on clarity was now awash in uncertainty. A pope who had built his entire papacy around the idea of unity had just been forced to declare the largest formal schism in nearly 4 decades. Leo himself said nothing publicly about the decree in the days that followed. His aides described him as somber but resolute. Those close to him said he'd agonized over the decision, that the letter to Paglarani had been a genuine attempt to prevent exactly what had happened, that the severity of the response was not punitive but medicinal. A harsh medicine, yes, but medicine nonetheless. The word the Vatican kept using was medicinal. The excommunications were meant to shock, to wake people up, to make the SSPX and its followers understand the gravity of what they had done, and hopefully to bring them back. But bringing them back would require something the SSPX had never been willing to give: submission, obedience, an acknowledgement that the Pope's authority is not optional, that the Second Vatican Council was not a mistake, that the Church can change and grow without betraying its foundation. For 50 years, the SSPX had refused to make that acknowledgement. And now, with 4 new bishops and a formal declaration of schism, the distance between Rome and Ione had never been greater. As the first week of July drew to a close, the Catholic world found itself holding its breath. The largest formal schism in nearly 4 decades was now a reality, and no one knew what would come next. Pope Leo XIV was preparing for a packed schedule. Trips to Africa were planned. The historic visit to France in September was taking shape, with the archdances of Paris scrambling to organize volunteer networks capable of handling 500,000 people. His encyclical on artificial intelligence, Magnifica Humanitas, the document where he had warned that humanity faced a choice between building Babel and rebuilding Jerusalem, was still reverberating through universities, tech companies, and policy circles around the world. The Trump administration continued to orbit around him, sometimes hostile, sometimes courting. Trump had called him weak on crime and terrible for foreign policy. Leo had responded by quoting the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He had survived confrontations with world leaders. He had navigated the politics of the Iran crisis. He had mourned at the graves of migrants and dined with ambassadors on the same day. But this was different. This was not a fight with a president or a policy. This was a wound inside the body of the church itself. And wounds like that do not heal with decrees. The SSPX had 751 priests, 264 seminarians, 250 religious sisters, representing 15 nationalities. They operated chapels, schools, and retreat centers across the globe. They were not going to disappear because Rome told them to. They had survived 1988. They had survived Pope Francis. They believed they would survive this too. And yet, for all of that, the image that lingered was simpler, more human. A pope sitting in a quiet room at dawn, a letter on his desk, a group of believers in a Swiss meadow singing in the rain with their dripping rosaries, and between them a chasm that centuries of tradition and a single sentence from a man in white could not bridge. Leo had told them to stop. He had told them clearly. He had told them with love and with law and with everything the church had at its disposal, and they had chosen to keep going. What happens next may define not just this papacy, but the shape of Catholicism for a generation.